Okay everyone, this is my first video as part of an official series addressing the thought and philosophy of Dr. Jason Jorjani. Now, I won't be contributing to this series often. I don't own his full corpus, and I wanted to go through his corpus. I own a number of his books, but not everything I'd like to have. I don't have everything that I'd like to have in my possession. But what we'll do, I'm working on a lot of other projects, research projects, so I don't want to put too much pressure on myself to churn these out too quickly. Plus, you know, as profound a thinker as he is, it's really necessary to spend some time really chewing on what he's saying to ensure that I both understand him accurately and articulate my position relative to his carefully. What I wanted to do in this, and when I say I want to critique his corpus, it's there are certain just very pivotal ideas that I want to highlight in his book. So when I take a book of his, I'm not going to be, well, number one, I find that much of it I already agree with a lot of his observations and interpretations, so we won't need to do a thorough critique or analysis. All we'll need to do is isolate a few core concepts in his corpus that I take issue with, and whenever they come up in his writings, we'll deal with them there. So this video is going to address a brief section of chapter 5 of his book Prometheus and Atlas, where he gets into a good discussion of the philosophy of the German philosopher Friedrich Schelling. Schelling articulates a position that seeks to bridge a false dichotomy in the dualisms of thinkers like René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, Plato, etc. So in this first video, I'm going to lay the groundwork for my disagreement with Jorjani, and by extension Schelling, in the following video, by showing, by explaining here where we agree. That way I think you'll be able to navigate a bit more easily through my thinking in the following video, where I articulate my disagreement. So Jorjani here in chapter 5 brings up Schelling's book on titled Bruno, which is a study in the alchemical philosopher, Italian philosopher, esoteric philosopher, Giordano Bruno, specifically Bruno's mystical hylomorphism. there's a character in Bruno in the book named Anselm, who takes up a more dualistic position. So when he brings up Anselm, you'll know who I'm talking about. And then as we go, I'll try to break down in my own words what's being said here, for those who may have a little bit of difficulty understanding what's being articulated. All right. And pardon me that I'm doing this with an allergy. Spring is here and my allergies are already kicking in. So, okay, so around section 4, 239 of the book, this is Jorjani now speaking, Bruno begins to advance an imaginal or imagistic understanding of ideas. By ideas, he's referring to the Platonic ideas, Plato's ideas. Plato's ideas, be they according to Plato or the predominant academic understanding of Plato's thought, teaches that the ideas of Plato are the eternal thought forms of the objects that exist here in our realm. So Bruno begins to advance an imaginal or imagistic understanding of ideas. In other words, the ideas as something more than simply total abstractions. They actually have an imagistic character, something that can be perceived. By 243 to 247, it becomes clear that the idea, as understood by Schelling's Bruno, is not so abstract as the bare concept that Anselm takes it to be. Rather, the idea spectrally, like in the sense of a spectral or a ghostly type phenomena, the idea spectrally conflates properties of the conceptual, or with the abstract, with that of the multiplicity of objects, corresponding to Plato's realm of shadows or copies down here on Earth, through which a given concept is intuited. So I'll read that last sentence again. Rather, the idea spectrally conflates properties of the conceptual with that of the multiplicity of objects through which a given concept is intuited. In other words, the idea, as understood by Schelling's Bruno, seeks to unite the properties of the conceptual with that of objects in order to not have this separation between the ideal or eternal realm and the realm of Plato's shadows. At 247 through 252, Bruno explains that both things and concepts are things meaning objects and concepts are abstracted aspects of ideas. Concepts and things correlate with one another, but they cannot exist independently of the phenomenal being of individual ideas. In other words, the ideas cannot exist separately or independently of the objects of being of those individual ideas. The idea is a living union of concept, the abstract, and thing, the concrete. Its generality or status as a type is a concrete generality, whereas the abstract concept has only a formalistically empty generality. Ideas are arche, or principal and overarching types. So they are still overarching types, as they are in Plato. That is, archetypes, but ones that do not abstractly stand over and against their quote-unquote copies, or their objects of instantiation. Nothing is entirely quote-unquote real, and nothing is purely quote-unquote ideal, where ideal is misunderstood in the academic sense. So nothing is entirely real, meaning entirely physical or concrete, and nothing is purely ideal, i.e. in the sense of being totally abstract. Reality is somewhere in the middle. Things are never entirely separate from consciousness. And consciousness is never totally devoid of sensuousness. In other words, consciousness has some type of materiality, if you will. Some critics have reproached Schelling for almost always being in suspense between idealism, realism, and even materialism. In the guise of Bruno's Alexander, another character in his book Bruno, he is certainly the advocate of Giordano Bruno's mystical hylomorphism. The so-called quote-unquote mental realm is just as phenomenal, in other words, sensible and qualitatively variegated, as the quote-unquote material realm. Extrasensory perception is still sensory. The psychical and somatic are relative dimensions of the spectral idea, the polarities of a super spectrum. In other words, the so-called abstract and the so-called real or concrete are just two different ends of a spectrum of the same overall reality. The mental has sensuousness, and the material is mental, in a sense. I think I'm going to end it there. I think that does enough to establish where we agree. In the next video, I'm going to show, however, that what Schelling has just described here, which Jorjani fully endorses, is, in my view, a description of consciousness in general, which, as I have said repeatedly, corresponds to the infinite body of God, which also corresponds to the power of God, or his feminine aspect. Shakti, as they call it in Vedic tradition, in the Shaivite tradition. And as we'll see in the next video, however, Jorjani and Schelling are defining the body and the spirit both as simply different points along this spectrum that he's just described. Whereas I take issue with that. I see spirit as something qualitatively very different from consciousness itself. Okay, that'll do it for this video.